Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining me this evening. I am Brian Lusk. Glad to have you here. We've got some interesting things that have happened in the last, 24 hours over in Ukraine, and some interesting things that have happened elsewhere to touch on as well. In particular, let's go ahead and get right into things with probably the biggest news of the day, though that's actually very debatable because there is so much that is packed in today that is important. So we'll start off with the new aid package that has been prepared by Republican House Representative, Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. Separate bills for Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, and some other items that are legislative priorities for him. So the bills basically duplicate what the Senate has already done. Instead of being as a single package, it's now split into four. There are some other changes to how it's being delivered, as in it's a loan instead of a direct payment. However, the president is then also able to forgive the loan at a time in the future. Lots of crazy things on here. Right off the bat, though, President Biden has already stated that he supports this package as it is written and wants it to get out there as fast as possible. That this includes humanitarian aid for Gaza, and they believe one of the packages even addresses some of the border security issues. Israel, Ukraine, Taiwan. He has said that he would pass it if they can get it done right away. The highlights of the bill, I've not looked at the bill myself, but there's been several people who have done deep dives into it already. The draft text of the bill for Ukraine has been published with the bill. This is the most important and interesting part. The bill obliges the U.S. president to hand over long-range ATACMS of an unspecified type to Ukraine as soon as possible after this bill enters into force. The president is able to postpone the handover if the transfer of ATACMS, in his opinion, will harm the national security interests of the United States. $61 billion in total will be allocated for Ukraine. Like I said, this is just the Ukraine aid bill. $11.3 billion for current U.S. military operations in the region, $13.8 billion for the purchase of the latest weapon systems, goods, and services for defense purposes. I believe that is intended to backfill the equipment we're sending to Ukraine in U.S. inventory, not the latest equipment being sent to Ukraine. $26 million, that's an M with an M, million, for continued oversight and accountability for assistance and equipment provided to Ukraine, $7.8 billion of direct financial assistance in credit to Ukraine. And after November 15th of this year, the president will be able to write off up to half of the debt amount after submitting the appropriate rationale to Congress. This does require the Pentagon and State Department to provide a clear strategy for Ukraine within 45 days. Something that should be really straightforward if the guys over at the Pentagon and the State Department have any level of readiness to do so. This discussion is about the as soon as practicable. Part of this is for the ATACMS missiles in particular. This has turned into a vital piece of war kit that Ukraine wants to rely heavily on. The problem is that they don't have enough of them to rely on for many more things than just what they have been already. A lot of people have been discussing this, the text of it. All the remaining debt after that November 2024 date could be written off after 2026, January 1st of 2026. That date feels significant, but I'm not putting my finger on it because that's well into a new presidency at that point in time, whether it's Biden or Trump or even Robert F. Kennedy Jr. President Biden did added some things to a Wall Street Journal op-ed, I guess you could say. He called for leadership and courage in Washington in order to pass the urgent military aid for Ukraine and Israel, adding, "Now is not the time to abandon our friends. Both Ukraine and Israel are under attack by brazen adversaries that seek their annihilation." Mr. Vladimir Putin wants to subjugate the people of Ukraine and absorb their nation into a new Russian empire. Now, I want to point out something here. Iran is providing Shahed drones to Russia and other missiles and materiel. So what before was two separate conflicts in principle has now become a unified conflict in many ways. Treating them as entirely separate now, I believe at least, is a mistake. Because the bad guys, the enemy on both of these fronts ends up being the same two people. And they're also working with other allies, North Korea, China. And the more that we do not oppose them, the more they're going to be emboldened to move forward. So continuing on, the plan is for the vote on Ukraine aid to take place on April 20th. That would be this very Saturday. That would also be before they go on their next vacation. I swear if I had as many vacations as these people did, I'd be sitting pretty. The political squabbles in passing a further aid have been costly. The longer it's delayed, civilians and soldiers alike have continued to die in Ukraine. That is a statement of fact. In fact, the recent loss of a power generating facility in Kiev Oblast, it can be directly attributed to the lack of air defense missiles. They ran out. They didn't have enough. As Anton Herashchenko states, voting for the bills on U.S. aid to Ukraine, Israel, and the Indo-Pacific is expected to take place on Saturday. Military and financial support for Ukraine is not charity. It is a vital component of global security. And I will add, it is a vital component to U.S. security, because the calmer and more peaceful the world is, the better our situation in the United States becomes. The freer trade, freer capabilities means that we can have a much better time on the world stage and both trade and do the transport goods across the world without threat of war stopping them from happening. Jens Stoltenberg did talk about the situation with helping Kiev and keeping their air defenses. He actually mentioned that he told NATO countries that if the choice is between 2% for their own defense and sending more aid to Ukraine, send more aid to Ukraine. They must choose Ukraine. Literally, that is the reason for that 2% to be spent, not specifically for Ukraine, but that money is being spent to defend these nations. And right now, Ukraine is the one defending these nations and keeping them from getting absolutely hammered by an increasingly aggressive Russia. Another tranche of EU macro financial assistance totaling 1.5 billion euros will be given to Ukraine next week, according to the European Commission. This is the second. Well, let me rephrase that. This is the second tranche they're expecting to happen for it. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next portion here. And before I do, I just wanted to say, hey, Ozzy, glad to have you here as always. You've posted some vids showing how it's celebrated. Okay, I'll have to pay attention to that and see if I can get over there and take a look. A secret Kremlin foreign policy document calls for Russia to leverage the war in Ukraine and exploit weaknesses in unfriendly states in order to forge a new global order in which the U.S. no longer plays a leading role, according to the Washington Post. This is the real end goal here. Russia is tired of having the United States as their opponent. They're tired of the United States. Let me rephrase that. They're tired of the United States being better than them. So they want to knock them off their perch at the top of the world, playing king of the mountain. And their hope is that they'll be able to become king of the mountain. The problem is that if you look at how the power dynamics are happening right now, Russia won't be the king of the mountain. It'll be China's Xi Jinping. Russia will just be a puppet state for China at this point in time. But the overall plan is to utilize the weaknesses of foreign adversaries for Russia in order to weaken them and prevent the Ukrainian allies from providing aid to Ukraine. Now, this is the Institute for the Study of War's Offensive Campaign Assessment. There is a tremendous amount of stuff here that ends up being scattered all throughout. And I will probably be addressing many of these things as we move forward, but they make some pretty interesting commentary here, and I wanted to address it real fast. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky emphasized that continued shortages in air defense systems and artillery are preventing Ukraine from effectively defending itself against Russian strikes and ground assaults. Kharkiv has been paying for that. Chernihiv has been also paying for that. Odessa has been paying for that. Situation on the front lines has been paying for that. Soldiers in the field have been paying for that. Civilians alike. There was the new mobilization law that was signed into effect on April 16th. That was a rough one for them, but they managed to put something together that everybody could support, at least initially. Russian forces in eastern Ukraine are using smaller groups to conduct assaults and are reportedly suffering from morale issues. But Russian attacks are unlikely to culminate in the near term, despite these challenges because of Ukrainian materiel shortages. Translation: the Russians are going to keep going as long as the Ukrainians don't have enough stuff to stop them. It doesn't matter what the morale is. It doesn't matter what equipment they can field. The truth is that they're using their waves of soldiers and their advantage right now in artillery shells and equipment to push every bit that they can. And now that aid from the United States appears likely to be coming soon, we're waiting on that bill to pass. And Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene have already threatened to vacate the speakership, even right now, to stop it from happening. But the support is there for it to happen. But overall, with that aid potentially coming very soon, the Russians want to push as much as they can, as long as they can. A Russian Stormzy instructor argued that Russian forces should capitalize on Ukrainian disadvantages brought on by material shortages to increase Russian guided glide bomb strikes to support Russian ground operations. Russia's already been flying airplanes over the battlefield in some of the most heavily contested territory. Their planes have been working effectively with impunity. They have gained local air superiority in certain areas of the battlefield because Ukraine does not have the air defenses to stop them anymore. Tying the two conflicts together here, Russian President Vladimir Putin continued to show support for Iranian aggression against Israel during a March 16th call with Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi. He expressed hope that Israel and Iran would show reasonable restraint and not allow a new round of confrontation, effectively preemptively blaming Israel for any response to the massive but unsuccessful Iranian missile and drone strike. Now, I believe it was Ryan McBeth talked about the situation there, talked about the exchanges. It could also have been Ward Carroll, but I don't remember for sure which one. Or Sandbox News. Doggone it, I've been watching a lot of stuff on this lately. One of those three talked about this extensively, talking about whether it, in fact, I think it was Sandbox News. Anyway, that they believe that overall the kinetic diplomacy aspect of this has failed for Iran, because it didn't do enough damage. Now, some people said, well, but that was a tremendously expensive defense. All those missiles cost millions of dollars versus the stuff that was thrown at Israel was cheap. Well, Israel also got a far greater GDP. They can absorb more of that cost. And by percentages, it looks like Israel won when you look at the actual costs as compared to GDP of the country. And the correct comparison is not how much of the stuff got through versus how much was stopped and the cost of the pieces that went together. The true comparison is what is the infrastructure and the human cost that would have been inflicted if those strikes had not been stopped. That's where the true comparison is. Xi Jinping met with the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and proposed prerequisites for the end to the war in Ukraine in a manner that suggests Xi is continuing to posture himself as a neutral mediator in the war, despite increasing reports of China's support for Russian war effort. And we have been seeing more support from China for Russia, and it looks like it's going to be continuing. They're hiding it in a lot of dual use things, but there are some other things that are kind of showing that there may be strains to the whole situation that are not being directly addressed. Ukraine Security Service recently destroyed a Russian Nebu-U long-range radar station in Bryansk, and they're continuing to target radar stations across the board. I'll be addressing some of that later. The Kremlin continues to centralize authority over the Chechen Republic head Ramzan Kadyrov's Akhmat Spetsnaz forces via the Ministry of Defense. That's meaning that they want to bring those guys under control because they don't want another repeat of what Wagner pulled off, namely a march on Moscow. And for the hilarity of it, Russian federal censor Roskomnadzor is considering banning TikTok in Russia. That'll really kind of be an interesting aside in the relationship with China. This is also from the Institute for the Study of War. This document talks about the real costs of letting Russia win. And rather than going through this point by point, I'm just going to paste the link here, right here. But I'm just going to mention this one starting line here. The current U.S. debate about providing additional military assistance to Ukraine is based in part on the assumption that the war will remain stalemated regardless of U.S. actions. That assumption is false. That's because every time the U.S. has provided significant support in the past, it has significantly impacted the battlefield, moving things forward. And if they will turn loose of the gear and the hardware and the material and the planes and the ATACMS missiles, they will find that Ukraine will make tremendous strides. Now, the next big piece of news here, Dzhankoy military airfield in Russian-occupied Crimea came under major fire. And this military airfield is a main logistics hub for the Russian army and is home to attack helicopters. And it's also got a large storage of various pieces of kit, including potentially, though I have only seen this from two sources, basically, enough to mention it, but not necessarily enough to confirm it, that there may have also been Zircon hypersonic missiles there as well. NASA's FIRMS, which shows fires around the world, confirms 6 distinct fires at the airfield. One of the major crossroads in the area was closed by traffic by authorities, and secondary detonations had been going on for hours and hours afterward. Now, my understanding is that the roads have been reopened, or at least the main part of them on the outskirts have been reopened in the area, so the overall explosions may have finally eased off. President Zelensky confirmed the strike on the airfield there, though he did not provide any additional information on the exact consequences. The analysis indicates that Ukraine may have used the ATACMS missiles to strike the airfield. Now, this is pretty tight. It's about 140 kilometers from the closest military unit to this airfield. And the ATACMS they have, I believe, are about 138 kilometer range, maybe a touch more, somewhere in that range. So it's questionable, but there's some pictures, and we'll get to that in a bit. This resulted in 6 massive explosions that hit the airfield, and the overall, this is a pretty successful strike. That's straightforward. It's successful 100%. No question in that regard. The Russian mill bloggers are the ones that have claimed that it was potentially with U.S.-made ATACMS missiles. And with all the facilities and infrastructure there, despite it being so close to the front lines, it's going to be interesting to see exactly what the final tally of trouble is in the end. This is some of the explosions cooking off earlier today, with a large-scale fire also reported in the area. And you can see that it's pretty devastatingly large. Here's one that's a much closer look at it, according to the reports. Now, this video in particular may not be actually from that area. I've not been able to confirm it, but it has been posted by several reliable sources. Today, the armed forces of Ukraine carried out the right strike on the occupier in Dzhankoy on the airfield. And he says that goes into normal speak on that material, but overall you can see that this is a successful strike. These were the road closures that were resulted from this thing, with several tens of kilometers of road blocked near Dzhankoy. They believe that they have cleaned up at least the areas that will be visible from the road. Here is a picture that is all the remains of the S-300 complex of the airfield at Dzhankoy, and we've got a full analysis from other sources, not official ones, on what may have been struck. I'll get to that in just a moment here. There was, however, this picture of debris that was circulated alongside the strike information. And this, now again, as Tyndar states here, it's to be treated as unconfirmed. I've seen this same picture from a couple of sources, but again, this is just what's being reported out there at this point in time. The parts may be from the back end of an ATACMS missile. Don't know for sure, and Tyndar's not able to truly analyze that and determine that for sure. Initial analysis of the losses were 3 launchers of the S-400 air defense system destroyed, 2 of the S-300 anti-aircraft missile launchers destroyed and critically damaged. Critically damaged radar and the ammunition storage was destroyed, with further updates including, they upped it to 6 total launchers, with the ammunition depot getting, as he says, dispersed over hundreds of meters explosively. Military equipment reception and repair center. No information on the actual vehicles, such as helicopters. I saw initial reports of 15 killed and 22 missing. The latest information I've got is 30 killed and 80 wounded. Again, these are numbers that are preliminary and just barely coming out at this point in time. Treat them with the necessary grain of salt, but they are generally likely in the ballpark. Knoll Reports did their report on this thing, also kind of addressing the same thing. There were some additional targets struck, though, and we'll talk about those in a bit here. And again, the Russian channels are talking about the ATACMS missiles being used, but of course the Russian channels also claim that nothing was destroyed either. So take your, you can see from the video that at least something was hit. Now, I believe I have, yes, I did. Okay, I can talk about that later. In the meantime, let's talk about something a little bit closer to home. The Scranton Army ammunition plant was potentially on fire today, reported as a small fire that was extinguished with no injuries. However, that still is probably likely to slow down the operation at the plant. This is the main production facility in the United States for 155mm and 105mm artillery projectiles, including things like the high fragmentation cartridges, 120mm mortars, training cartridges, high explosives, illumination shells, white phosphorus, 8-inch and 175mm artillery, 5-inch naval gun projectiles. They produce all these things here at the Scranton Army Ammunition Plant in Scranton, Pennsylvania. That said, like I said, the latest report is that it was a small fire that was extinguished with no injuries. It sure looked like it was a lot bigger than small, but I'll be watching for further if anything pops out on it. And in that same vein, there was an explosion at a defense plant in Wales with no casualties and the causes being investigated. It seems like this is becoming a pattern. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here. This is just speculation at this point, but a lot of these facilities are cranking up their production rates to wartime production levels. And they may be bringing new people on, or they may be working faster than they used to do. And therefore, they may be not necessarily circumventing safety measures, but may be making mistakes along the way. And that could explain it. Then again, so could willful sabotage, such as this is the person on this one is suggesting. Either way, it's something to keep an eye on and to be vigilant on. Let's go ahead and move on to the news out of Ukraine itself. Ozzy, to answer your question, I'm not sure I can, because I was not one of the ones who voted for her, obviously, because she's not even from my state. Oftentimes, the type of person who would vote for her is somebody who votes straight party ticket. Other times she's a firebrand and they like what she says. Many people in the electorate prefer to get the firebrand who says the right things, to them at least, what they believe to be right. And Marjorie Taylor Greene apparently scratches that itch for some people. I'm not going to speak on that any further. That's just kind of answering your question there. At some point, I may go into a little bit more about about that particular race. I'm watching that one. Ukraine claims to have destroyed a record number of Russian military equipment in March 2024, with a total of 4,894 pieces of military equipment in the past month. That's all kinds of various pieces of equipment, between vehicles and fuel tanks, armored vehicles, tanks, artillery, UAVs, and other. I genuinely wonder, there was an assault the other day by a group of men on motorcycles. Do they count the motorcycles as individual targets, and therefore one motorcycle is one more on the list? Or do they count it as a group of motorcycles being destroyed? I'd be interested to find out. The energy sector in Ukraine is very difficult. The largest provider of energy, DTEK, is reporting that they have lost 80% of their generating capacity. It's going to get a lot harder before it's going to get better at this point. Ukrainian engineers designed the Kronos submarine. Now, this is a submersible that can fire torpedoes with a top speed of 50 kilometers per hour, and they claim it can move without sound at that speed. That can also carry a payload of explosives. I believe they said something like 1,000 kilos of explosives. Hang on, I got to look at the article here. Accommodates up to 10 passengers. Can carry a payload of explosives, has sonars, radars, communication systems, night vision cameras, 360-degree cameras, an electronic periscope, and it's claimed it's able to patrol coastlines, conduct reconnaissance, military evacuations, and even attack enemies with a system with 6 missiles. And it has an electric motor and can reach speeds of up to 50 kilometers per hour, propelled by underwater wings. Interesting phrasing. Now, the actual design here says there's a water jet, not wings, per se, and I believe they have mixed their metaphors there for a little bit, but we'll have to see if that gets corrected later. But overall, that's an interesting piece of gear. This submersible would be apparently one of the first ones that they're doing that are manned at this point in time. So interesting to see there, and I'll be interested to see if we hear about further operations. Sneaking troops onto Crimea using a submersible like this would probably be a lot safer than bringing them in little tiny boats. I believe I mentioned this yesterday, and this is from Josep Borrell, the EU's foreign policy chief, stated it's cheaper to buy Patriot systems than to rebuild the power plant targeted by the Russians. Straightforward, no other comments needed. Moscow is preparing a provocation against Ukraine, allegedly related to the illegal circulation of Western weapons in Africa, according to Defense Intelligence of Ukraine. This is a common canard they like to pull out whenever they are having some trouble on the battlefield, especially when aid is potentially coming pretty soon. And whenever it looks like there's going to be a new aid package, they start talking about, oh, the Ukrainians are selling all of this equipment on the black market. It's getting up in other places. And they never provide evidence proving that. And Chernihiv has gotten really hit hard. The last number I saw was 17 killed and many others wounded in an attack on civilian objects such as apartment buildings and the like in Chernihiv. It's been another rough day. Let's go ahead and move on to the news out of Russia here. Belgorod got its own taste of the war for a little bit, with big explosions reported in the city. No real reports as to what might have been hit, though there might be. Now, this is a different one here. Another explosion was reported in Voronezh, with this one potentially targeting a military unit or an oil depot that was close to it. Now, the Russians have claimed that all that was hit was a woodlot in Voronezh. But again, they don't provide any evidence of that, so I'd have to see if they can ever pull anything off of that. The reports that the Ukrainians are stating is that the kamikaze jet drone hit a fuel tank on the territory of military unit 75044, as in the 866th Fuel Warehouse. In addition, Ukraine hit a Russian bomber factory in Tatarstan. The Russians claimed that 2 drones were shot down over the region, and yet there was apparently confirmed damage to the bomber factory in Tatarstan. I did see several sources on that that did show damage, so I believe that is 100% confirmed. In that same vein, Russia's Tatarstan is to implement a program to employ minors in the defense industry. This would be minors aged 14 to 18, with the goal of increasing youth employment. So they're going to put kids in their defense industry so that they can point at them and say, see, the Ukrainians are targeting our kids. Maybe if they wouldn't have their kids building bombs, they wouldn't be targeting their kids. Flooding is getting intense in Russia. The Russian city of Kurgan now has water levels exceeding the dangerous mark, rising 18 centimeters in 2 hours. That'd be about that much, roughly. Yeah, that's about right. With a population of 300,000, the local government has called for immediate evacuation. Ukraine has stated that they have destroyed a Russian Mi-8 helicopter on the tarmac over in Samara. That's 800 kilometers from the border with Ukraine, and claimed it was a planned sabotage. We often talk about Ukraine rooting out corruption amongst... Pardon, let me get this turned off. We often talk about Ukraine rooting out corruption, and every once in a while, and there's plenty of stories about this, but every once in a while I like to point out that there are plenty of stories of Russian corruption as well. Former employees of the Ministry of Internal Affairs were accused of receiving a record bribe in the amount of 4.9 billion rubles. Back to flooding for a moment here. Residents of flooded Orsk draw water from puddles or hand buckets outside their windows during rain, according to Russian media. There's been no tap water supply in the city for 12 days already due to the floods. Water is now worth its weight in gold in Orsk. Drinking water is delivered by volunteers, and there are huge queues for it. The water flows out of the tap intermittently and is dirty. My son, owing to forgetfulness, used this water while brushing his teeth. The result was a fever of 40 degrees Celsius and vomiting for 3 days. He was poisoned. According to Orsk mayor, the wells will be put into operation when the floods recede, because if floodwaters get into the wells, the drinking water will be contaminated. And from Dmitry at War Translated, while Putin declares protection of his sovereignty, Russia has become a full-fledged colony of China. For Russia, China is the largest market for raw materials, 32% of exports, and the main supplier of good, 41% of imports. However, Russia itself accounts for only 3.3% of Chinese exports, amounting to $3.5 trillion, and is not even among the top 5 of its export markets. And this is according to Russian economic commentator Anatoly Nesmayan. So once again, we're seeing evidence that Russia is becoming a vassal state of China. Russia doesn't care, because if you look at it from a certain perspective, Russia's got all these other people, like the United States, willingly buying their goods. They're bigger trading partners by far. But by effectively taking Russia off of the world stage as an opponent, they have managed to secure some of their own future, at least for the short term. Now, this is a kind of a big one right here. Ukraine launched a strike at a Russian radar station in Mordovia Republic. Now, I had to look it up. Here's the Mordovia Republic, and I went from Kiev to Mordovia. That is a distance of 611.18 miles, or that would be about 1,000 kilometers. That's quite the strike. They accurately struck this over-the-horizon radar. Now, this radar is used to watch for things going on in space, watch for the launch of missiles, such as intercontinental ballistic missiles that would be launched against them, and the like. So it is part of Russia's nuclear monitoring strategy, part of their Russian strategy for nuclear weapons. This video purports to show it. They'll see teeny tiny way off in the background, a little puff of smoke. This is a container over the horizon radar with a target detection range of about 3,000 kilometers and a detection altitude of more than 100 kilometers. However, Newsweek points out that this crosses the Kremlin's nuclear red line. This is part of the early warning network for a nuclear strike, including the use of ballistic missiles could have been affected. This this container over the horizon radar is located there. The strike is a possible violation of one of the red lines for the use of nuclear weapons. In other words, a disruption of the response of nuclear forces. Now, of course, that's Newsweek, so take that for whatever you want to believe in it. We'll move on to the international front. Ozzy says the Moldovians are indigenous first Ugric speakers. I believe it, yeah, because they're just yet another one of the areas that Russia has managed to absorb. On the international front, the latest draft EU summit concludes that the European Council calls for a swift adoption of imposing further tariffs on imports into the European Union of Russian, and I believe that's Belarusian? Yeah, Belarus agricultural products, while ensuring that the transit of such goods to developing countries remains unaffected. In fact, the governments of Belgium and Czechia have sent a letter to other EU leaders calling for new restrictive measures against Russia over its disinformation activities within the European bloc. Russia's throwing everything they've got at these disinformation activities. They have to win in the information war, or they will never win on the battlefield. It's that simple. Long lines of Russian equipment and soldiers were seen leaving Nagorno-Karabakh over in Armenia, or Armenia area there. The peacekeepers are withdrawing entirely. A lot of speculations as to why that might be. I suspect the real truth is that they're needed elsewhere, and there's no longer a political will to keep them there with the situation with Armenia and I think it's Azerbaijan. Dang it, it's been a while since I looked at the map there. Polish protesters are planning to renew a blockade at yet another crossing. They've been going for a couple of days, or at least are going to go for a couple of days. And as long as they're only blocking one of the crossings, then it's something that can be worked around. But it is troubling to see it continuing. A court in France seized the villa of Vladimir Putin's ex-wife, Ludmila Otsaratnaya, and this 450-meter is located near Biarritz in the city of Anglet. She bought for 5.4 million euros in December 2013, 6 months after her divorce. And that's just an interesting little bit. Seems like it's an odd item to do right now. I'd have to look into all the details behind it. Just seems interesting. Going to put it that way. 4 Chinese banks stopped accepting payments in yuan from Russia. And this is one more sign. This is the sign I was mentioning earlier that the relationship between Russia and China may not be quite so rosy or hunky-dory as they like to pretend it is. It's, at least it looks to me as though China just really doesn't care. They've got what they wanted out of this. They're supporting Russia because Russia is stirring up the pot and causing trouble and causing their Western powers to focus elsewhere. And that's really what they want out of it. The Netherlands states that they are ready to buy Patriot air defense systems for Ukraine from countries that are not ready to transfer them to Ukraine for free. We can buy it from them. We can deliver it to Ukraine. We have the money available. It's crucial. He also said that the Netherlands has 4 Patriot batteries with 1 in reserve. He said that when we fall below the minimum requirements that we must set for our operational readiness and international obligations. So they don't report that they have any to spare at this point in time, but they're willing to pony up the cash if somebody's willing to provide the system. I hate to say it this way, but think of how the United States could be making bank right now, taking one of their old Patriot systems offline and shipping it over there and having the Netherlands pay for it. Maybe I ought to look for one of those government auctions. Maybe I can find a Patriot system on there. Joking, obviously. All right, going on to the deep state map. Not a lot of changes today. Fighting continues in Berdichi, Krasnohorivka, and South Orozhina. And the advance over here is in Otsaratne, there we go, which is northwest of Avdiivka. And you can see here the Russians have pushed through these forested areas and along this road to really get into the outskirts of this decent-sized town. I'd be concerned if I was them because they're kind of sticking their necks out here. But if the Ukrainians don't have the resources to lop that off, it's probably a safe bet for them at this point. Bilohorivka, this new geolocated footage shows Russian advances east of the town near the industrial sector. And while this area has changed hands quite a few times, the Russians seem to be established with fighting still happening in the area. Overall, I went through the Russians' perspective through War Gonzo here. Heavy fighting continues on the Zaporizhia front with the use of long-range weapons. Donetsk front, Russian troops continue to slowly but surely advance at Novomikhailivka. On the southern outskirts of Krasnohorivka, saying they actually gained a foothold over previously occupied lines. Ukrainians were counterattacking in order to push back the Russian troops, but fighting is continuing in that city. There's some advances in the Netolovo area, and according to some reports, the Russians were able to enter the outskirts of that settlement in the area of Semyonovka, there we go, and Berdichi. No significant changes to the lines of control, but fierce fighting, and good progress towards Ochotino and Novobakhmutivka. Chasov Yar, the Russians continue to advance in that area, but no real changes on the lines at this point in time, except for the reports they're getting closer and closer. Overall, though, I noted something was missing, and that is the Kupiansk direction. The Kupiansk direction was so hot for weeks, and I've not seen a lick of mention of it lately. So I went and did a little bit of searching, and reporting from Ukraine reports that the situation in Kupiansk region has been stabilized, that the Ukrainians have taken advantage of the situation as it is and have managed to use drone operations to knock out supply depots in those areas across much of that region and knocked the Russians back onto their heels. So, at least in the area of Kupiansk at this point in time, it appears that the Ukrainians have gained the upper hand. In that same vein, it looks like at least overall, the reporting is that Ukraine might be stabilizing that whole area at the moment. Sort of related, reporting from Ukraine YouTube channel has had a bunch of trouble with bots reporting their content. It's some of the best blow by blow reporting on various battles that happen in Ukraine. And if you ever just have these videos are about 5 or 10 minutes long. So I definitely encourage you, if you have the time, to go and watch some of the details on what's going on in some of these operations. I touched the surface enough to know what's going on. He digs into the details and makes for a very interesting story overall. But he's been mass reported by Russian trolls and bots, and they're continuing to have trouble there. So supporting him would go a long way to help him out. And I would appreciate if you would. I don't have his link handy here. Here, let's go to YouTube. There we go. Drop this in here if you are interested in that level of reporting. Like I said, it's interesting to see the stories behind some of the action going on. I keep a relatively surface level, knowing what's going on, and he digs in quite a bit deeper on specific encounters. Moving on to the interesting extras. Now you see the Russian flag. Now you don't. That's quite the explosion, and it took that flag right out. Anton Dzhankoy gave us a little bit of a commentary here. What the West is afraid of. What will happen in Russia without Putin? Revolution and turmoil in Russia. Uncontrolled nuclear weapons. And he makes the point that this is going to happen anyway. Putin will be gone soon. He's not exactly a young guy. Russia's already showing signs of potential disintegration. Either we can be afraid of it and do this whole, kid gloves thing with Russia, or we can make this quick and efficient and painless. And that means we got to see things as they really are and ditch the fear and turn on the common sense. And he makes the statement that assistance to Ukraine is key to this. Ukraine is where the future is decided. And I've pretty much made that exact same point multiple times now. By not facing Ukraine, the Iranians saw that they were not likely to be stopped in Israel. The situation in South America, same thing. The Chinese are eyeing up Taiwan, all because we did not do a direct, clear stop to Russia. That's a good view of exactly what I was going to talk about next. In Tbilisi, Georgia, after hitting a pro-Russian member of parliament, Aleko Elisashvili explained that he had punched him right in his Russian face, and he could shove the pro-Russian law up his backside, as Georgians will not be slaves. As journalist Jason J. Smart states, Russia only understands force. This whole situation in Georgia is getting increasingly disruptive. There have been crowds and demonstrations. It's going to cause some serious things to happen, and I think pretty quick. This is just the beginning. This is a 1.5-minute long video of constructing the defensive lines on the Zaporizhzhia front. Ukraine is working feverishly to build as many defensive lines as they can. The less assistance they have, by the way, I thought this was fun. He has a calibrated stick here. Did you see that on the right side? He has a stick that's set to the right length, and he uses that to check exactly where he wants the pole to go. So then he just has the earth mover handle actually pushing the pole down into the dirt. But overall, they are building these fortifications. And the truth is that fortifications are a sign of hope. They believe they're going to be able to hold these lines. Otherwise, there'd be no point in building the fortifications. So whenever you see a fortification like this going up, it is a sign that Ukraine has faith that they can hold it, that they can retain what is theirs. And it's a small sign that they're looking to a future that could potentially have this land back entirely in their control. So whenever you see a defensive line go up, look at it as a sign of hope in Ukraine. With all the war going on in Ukraine, you don't often see some of the unusual things that are happening. Ukrainian surgeons performed a successful brain surgery on a 4-year-old Northern Irish child when doctors in the UK were unwilling to perform the complex surgery. This led the family to seek out help wherever they could find. And they found a team of specialists in Lviv who performed the surgery that hopefully resolved her seizure issues. This is a rare form of epilepsy, and the complex surgery was done by this crew here in Ukraine, showing that they are they're not selfish. The Ukrainians have every right to be selfish at this point in time, and yet they are generous to a fault. And we'll end off with this video from Dubai. In case you missed it, Dubai has gotten more rain in about a 1-day period or 2-day period than they get in an entire year, and it has resulted in flooding. And if you're not familiar with how things work in deserts, there's a reason why flash flooding is common in deserts, even though there's so little rain. It's because the ground in a desert is not designed, for lack of a better way to say it, to retain water. So all of the surfaces underneath, the hardened, packed surfaces, don't absorb water. In fact, the water just runs over the top of it. So you have to specifically design your desert infrastructure to deal with the flooding. That's coming from somebody who grew up in the desert southwest of the U.S. So this, the truth is that they did not have the preparation to handle an entire year's worth of rainfall that would have just disappeared into the ground in, the Midwest of the U.S. or any green area of the world. Instead, it flooded the place, and I'll just let the video kind of speak for itself here. In case you can't see it, that is a cat holding on to the door handle. And some rescuers in a boat found the cat and extracted it from its situation. Now, if you've ever tried to pull a cat away from that type of situation, they don't like to be picked up. And they react poorly at first, but as soon as the cat's set down, the cat meows. Almost a thank you to its rescuers. Poor cat's absolutely soaked and was panting hard. Probably wouldn't have stayed on that door handle for much longer. Say what you will, but that's where you can see people's true hearts. And that's everything for today. Thank you very much for joining me today. Again, I'm glad to have you here. And I always appreciate you guys being here with me every time and for every video. If you have any questions, absolutely leave them in the comments. I'll absolutely watch for them. And if I can get you an answer, I will do my best to do so. Again, thank you for joining me. You have a great rest of your day, and we will see you on the next video.